deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. This is the word of God.
Well, in March of 2022, The Ringer, which is a sports and entertainment website, it published an article by its NBA reporter, Jonathan Tjarks. And it wasn't the kind of article that Jonathan normally wrote. It wasn't the kind of article that The Ringer normally publishes. It wasn't about the NBA, it wasn't about basketball, it wasn't about sports. It was an intensely personal article. This was the title: "Does My Son Know You? Fatherhood, Cancer, and What Matters Most." The article was about Jonathan's experience being diagnosed with a rare form of terminal cancer at age 33. He wrote it about a year after that diagnosis and 6 months before he died at age 35, leaving behind a wife and a 2-year-old son. And that's what the article was about: fatherhood, cancer, and what matters most. But it's the title of the article that stuck with me. This is the title, that question: does my son know you? Jonathan tells a story in there. He tells a lot of stories, a number of different stories. One of those is about his own father, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's when Jonathan was only 6. By the time he was 12, his father was basically unresponsive in a wheelchair. When he was 21, his dad died. And he wrote that at his father's funeral, he says, "There were a bunch of people whom I hadn't seen in years. They all told me how sorry they were, and they asked whether there was anything that they could do. And all I could think was, I don't know any of you. I know of you. I've heard your names, but I don't know you." His father was sick for a long time, basically his whole life that he remembered. And Jonathan says everyone was supportive at first, but then they drifted away. And so years later, when his funeral actually came, he knew the names of his father's friends, but he didn't know them. He'd heard of them, but he didn't know them. And then years later, Jonathan was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he had a 2-year-old son. And he wrote in that article not just about fatherhood and cancer, but also about what matters most. Jonathan's a Christian, and though it's not a Christian website, he wrote honestly about his faith, his struggle with his faith, but also how he was leaning on his Christian faith and his church family through his diagnosis. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "There are some things from the Bible that I've been leaning on over the past year since he was diagnosed." And he quoted these 3 verses. James 1:27, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress." Isaiah 1:17, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow." Exodus 22:22, "You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child." You can see why he was thinking about these things. And he wrote, there are hundreds of verses in the Bible like that. And then he wrote this: "I've already told some of my friends, when I see you in heaven, there's only one thing I'm going to ask. Were you good to my son and my wife? Were you there for them? Does my son know you?" He said he wanted his son Jackson to one day wonder why his dad's friends were always hanging out with him, to the point where he got a little sick of them. Does my son know you? And he wrote that what he wanted to leave his wife and his son was, this is his words, relational insurance. He said, people talk about medical insurance and life insurance when you get sick, but relational insurance is far more important. Relational insurance. It's an interesting concept. Relationships that are strong and good as you invest in them in the good times, and that don't fall apart in the bad times, in the times when you can't be there for other people, but you need them to be there for you. Where do you get relational insurance? You know, there's an ancient Hebrew word that doesn't translate to relational insurance, but it speaks to this need. It's a word I mentioned the last time. It's a Hebrew word. You may remember it. Chesed. Chesed. It's one of the most important theological words in the Old Testament. It's mentioned 250 times. There is no single, it's used 250 times. There's no single English word that translates chesed. It's translated all kinds of different ways. You can't capture it, but I believe chesed in action, especially in the people of God, chesed in action is relational insurance. That's what it is. That's one way of understanding it. And so how do you translate a word that can't be defined in English? How do you make sense of it? Well, if you can define it. A definition is important, but another way to figure out what chesed means is to tell a story that shows what chesed is like in action. That's what Ruth is. Ruth, this book, uses the word chesed a number of times, one of them in our passage, but it is actually a story that fleshes out what chesed looks like. It demonstrates it for us. And so today, we're going back to the story. We're diving back into it. We're going to follow the characters to a fork in the road, a turning point, and we're going to see chesed there. We're going to learn what we learned there after we kind of see the story, what it has to show us about chesed. Two things. We're going to see the story, and then two things that this story shows us about chesed. What it is and where it comes from. What it is and where it comes from. So we need to go back to the story. Ruth is a story above all. Now you may remember, let me just remind you, it's been 2 weeks since we looked at this book. So let me just remind you the setting in the first 5 verses that were not read today. This is a story that starts in dark times. I said it starts in Gotham City in a Batman comic. That's what in the days of the judges means. The book of Judges is a story about Israel's collapse as a society. It is about a time of spiritual darkness. The book of Judges ends with these words. In those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It was chaos and spiritual darkness. That's where the story starts, not just there. As I said last time, not just spiritual darkness, but social crisis. So, verse 1, days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And those two things are related, by the way, the spiritual darkness and the famine in the land, those things are connected. When God made a covenant with Israel, when he made the covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, when he gave his word to them, you see this in Deuteronomy, he told them, if you keep faith with me, I'm giving myself to you, and if you keep faith with me, I will bless you. And if you break faith with me, if you break my covenant, there will be curses. This is what it says, covenant blessings as they obey God and walk in his way. But he warns them straight up. He says, if you walk away, there are covenant curses. You know what one of those covenants are that's spelled out in Deuteronomy? One of those is famine. And any Jewish reader would have heard that and known these things are connected. The people have turned away from God and they are reaping what they have sown. In fact, there's an irony in the text right here that any first reader would have heard. These people that we're going to see in a moment, this family that's at the center of the story is living in Bethlehem. And if you know what Bethlehem means, you may know what Bethlehem means. Bethlehem means house of bread. That's what the name of the town means. So the whole town is supposed to invoke in you the feeling of walking into a bakery. I mean, and smelling warm bread, and the ovens are warmed up, and it's that hot, fresh bread coming out. And the irony is they live in the bakery, but the shelves are empty. And there's no flour left in the bin, and the ovens have gone cold. It's spiritual darkness and social chaos, and so they leave. Elimelech, this man, makes a tremendously difficult decision. He leaves to go to Moab, a foreign land where they worship another god. They move there. Their sons actually marry daughters from the land. That means women who don't share their religion, but these boys marry in the land. They're there for 10 years. After they're there for 10 years, already a hard time, tragedy strikes, and in just a few sentences, we are told that Naomi, this is the family, mother, father, 2 boys, then they get married, 2 boys and their wives. They're living together in the land when tragedy strikes. The father, Elimelech, dies. 2 of the sons, both of them die, one after another. All that is left is Naomi, the wife, and her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And that's kind of where we had left the story. We looked a little bit ahead. And Naomi is in a position of incredible vulnerability, as are Orpah and Ruth. Women in that culture really had no advocate or even way to do basic things like feed themselves without a husband or a son. A tremendously vulnerable position. Naomi needs relational insurance right here. And she does have her daughters-in-law, and so we pick up the story in verse 6 where we just heard the passage read. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. She hears that the house of bread, the shelves are getting restocked. They're firing up the ovens again. Something has happened. There's food back home. And so she goes back home, and she takes her daughters-in-law with her, and they're walking down a road. So can you picture it? These three women, maybe dressed in black or the equivalent of black, marking that they're in mourning, and they're walking down this dusty wilderness road between Moab and Bethlehem, somewhere between modern-day Jordan and modern-day Bethlehem. It's still there in the West Bank. And they're walking along, and the whole way, I think this is what's happening. Naomi is thinking. She's thinking. What are we going to do? What are we going to do when we get there? And she's thinking until she comes to a point where she stops them in a road, and it is a decisive moment. She stops the whole trip, and she stops, and she has something to say to Orpah and to Ruth. And the thing she says to them is, you guys need to go back home. You shouldn't come with me. Why? She's going back home, they aren't. She's going back where she has a chance, maybe. Actually, she's not even sure she does. In fact, she doesn't think she does. Did you hear what she says? I pointed this out last time in verse 12. She says, return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, how would that help you? You hear, even if I thought there was still hope for me. She's honest. She's going back to her hometown, and she still doesn't know if she's going to be able to survive there. But she says, you guys don't have a shot. It's time for us to stop pretending like this is going to work. This is my paraphrase of what Naomi is saying. When we go back, first of all, the famine was not that long ago. Who's going to take in 3 more mouths to feed? Who's going to take in 3 more mouths when two of them are foreigners from a country where people don't even like each other. When 2 of them are not related, you have no blood ties. No one is responsible for you here. And by the way, when you go back, who's going to marry you? You've already been married. You're not from here. You're not the people, you are Moabites. We are not supposed to marry Moabites. She's saying, when you go back, I have no hope. And if you go back, there'll be no hope for you either. That's what she's saying to us. She says, go back home. And it seems like these 2 young women may even have had families that are still alive. When she says in verse 11, she says, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me anymore? Verse before that, verse 8, sorry. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home, which may indicate, go back home. Your mom is still alive. Go back home to her. There's a chance for you there. But if you go with me, there's no chance. And here's what she's doing. She's kindly thinking about them, and she's giving them what one commentator says, kind of a tough love speech. They obviously love each other, and yet she's saying there's no hope for us if we stick together. And they cry. There's obviously real affection. And you picture the scene on the road. She's telling them, she's trying to just level with them. She's saying, you've got to go back. And they cry and they hug her. They wept, it says in verse 9, and they said, we will go back with you. And she says, no, you've got to go back. You've got to go back. And I just want you to imagine you're sitting alongside the road hundreds of years ago watching this play out. And you see these 3 women. You see this one woman stop. You see her talking to the others, gesturing to them. They're hugging. They're crying. One of the women turns and goes back, right? Where Naomi is the turning point. I can just imagine her standing there. To her right is Bethlehem, to her left is Moab. And she's saying, you need to go back. And Orpah and Ruth are faced with this decision, and they hug her and they embrace her. And Orpah does the reasonable thing. She's not criticized for it. She does the reasonable thing. She goes home to Moab. And if you were sitting outside the road, you would see the 3 of them standing there, and you would see this crying and embracing, and then one of the women walks off back the way they've come. But another young woman, is holding on to the older woman. Do you see her? It says Ruth clung to her. Clung to her. And then, if you were watching, you would see her, and this is how I picture it, and I'll give you some evidence for a moment. All of a sudden, they're still talking, and then Ruth, the younger woman, gives this speech. Maybe she kind of plants her own foot. There's a gesture. She gives a little speech, and she's not going anywhere, and at some point, finally, the older woman just relents, and now the two of them walk in the other direction toward Bethlehem. What happened? What happened there? If you were watching, you would say there's some story there. Right? Wouldn't you? What happened there was Hesed. Hesed. So what is it? Let's zoom in. What is Hesed and where does it come from? What is it? And I said a story, not give you a definition. I'm still going to give you a definition. Here's what Hesed is. Hesed is a commitment to give yourself to and for another person. That's what Hesed is. It's a commitment to give yourself to and for another person. They have this speech. I said Orpah does what is reasonable. She goes on. And she goes off back home even with Naomi's blessing. And in fact, the blessing is important. Would you just look with me for a moment at verse 8? Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Guess what? Remember how I said that word hesed is translated a lot of different ways? You know what the word kindness is? Chesed. It's hesed. It's may the Lord show you this kind of committed kindness to you and for you. May he give himself to you and for you. That's what she's praying over Orpah and Ruth. May the Lord give himself to you and for you as you go your way and I'm going to go mine. Just as you have up to this point shown me your committed kindness. It's right here. And Orpah is blessed by Ruth with this prayer for her own flourishing in the kindness of the Lord, and she goes back. But Ruth doesn't, and all of what Ruth does demonstrates, I'm going to point this out in a moment, demonstrates that Ruth has, in 10 years living with Naomi, and we don't know, we're going to talk next week more about Naomi, but in 10 years living with Naomi, she has picked up a lot of what Naomi believes about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Hesed, the God of committed kindness. Ruth is right on this road, as we're going to see in a moment, about to make a commitment to this God, but for 10 years she's been listening and watching and seeing Naomi live out what Hesed is. Because when the moment comes, Orpah turns and goes, but Ruth clings to her. I said that was significant. You can see that right down in verse 14. They wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. It's a word that's actually used in Genesis 2:24, the Hebrew word. It's the word for what Adam does to his wife, and the man will cling to his wife. It's a covenant word. This isn't marriage. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it is a word of committed taking hold of another person. It's significant that that's the way she's described. She's willfully holding on to Naomi. And then she gives her speech, which is astonishing. Did you hear it? Just this amazing moment. As Naomi says, "Go back, leave me. There's no hope if you come with me. Let me go on hopeless and alone." And Ruth says, listen to it. Ruth says, "Don't urge me," verse 16, "to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." She can say in no stronger way, there is no way I'm leaving you. I'm not going to leave you ever. not to the grave. Ruth says, I said this last time, I think, if you could go and find where Naomi was buried and dig up her bones, from what Ruth said, you would find Ruth's bones right next to her. It's chesed. It is a self-giving commitment. It is a commitment to give yourself to another person and for another person, because Ruth knows she is walking into hopelessness, but she will not leave Ruth even though it may cost her everything. That's chesed. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. All the way to the end. I am with you. That's chesed. It's not marriage. It's not even a blood relationship. They're not even related by blood. But it is this story intended to communicate to us the beauty and the glory of chesed. Just think about it. I said if you were alongside the road. If you were alongside the road, just this moment, this decision is pulled out, is highlighted in the scripture. And if you were watching, or according to the headlines on the CNN of this ancient world, or of Fox News, or of the New York Times, or of the Kennebec Daily Journal, this moment doesn't make it onto the back page of the paper, right? According to the world, these women have no power. They have nothing. They have no wealth. According to the wisdom of the world, they're of no account. But the story is included in the Bible to show us the value of this kind of commitment to God. God says chesed is glorious reflection of the greatest power and the greatest authority and the greatest glory in the universe. God shows chesed. God gives himself to and for people without reserve. God is a God of covenant commitment. And when people say, I give myself to you like that, God says that is glorious. And he puts it in the Bible, and the fact is, he changes history through that moment. That's what that is. This is what chesed is, and it's what he requires of us. Micah 6, 1 through 8. Do you know that passage? Micah 6, 1 through 8. This is what the prophet Micah says. He has shown you, O man, he has shown you, men and women, he has shown you what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To do justly, you know this, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Remember how I said that word chesed gets translated a lot of different places? Here it is again, to love mercy. That's to love chesed. And you know what's translated mercy? Because it is a commitment to give yourself to and for another person. That means when another person needs your help, your forgiveness, your kindness, when they can't give it back to you, but you have the opportunity to give it to them, when it costs you something to be there for someone else, when it's merciful to be there for someone else. What God says, what I require is that you would do justice and you would love mercy. You would love chesed just because I love chesed. I am chesed. It is glorious. It is what God calls us to give yourself to and for another person. Now, obviously, we cannot do for everyone what Ruth did for Naomi. You can't say, and I would not encourage you to say to everyone after today, hey, just come up to somebody at coffee time and say, listen, where you go, I'm going to go. Where you lodge, I will lodge, and it will take death to break us apart. Most people don't want you to do that, right? This is a particular example, and yet, in our relationships, we should be showing this kind of chesed. This is glorious. What does that look like? Well, certainly it does mean in marriage. This passage is sometimes read in marriages. I hear that at wedding ceremonies. I've never read it at a wedding ceremony I've been at, but maybe you've heard it there. To be clear, we'll move on from this in a moment. It's not about marriage, and yet it is about marriage. Marriage is a commitment where you vow chesed to your husband or to your wife. You make vows. And as Gary Thomas says, he puts it very well. He says, Christianity involves believing certain things, to be sure, but its herald, its hallmark, its glory is not in merely ascribing to certain intellectual truths. Yes, I believe that. He says the beauty of Christianity is in learning to love, and few life situations test that as radically as marriage. And so he says, if you want to truly love God, look right now at the ring on your left hand and commit yourself to exploring anew what that ring represents and to love the fleshly person you put that ring on. And he says this might be the most spiritual thing you can do. But it's not just about marriage, because actually this isn't about marriage. Hesed should show up in other relationships, in our friendships, in our commitments, in the church. Let me push it a bit. Claire Coffey, in November 15th article, whose name I didn't write down here, but I can give it to you, wrote about a trend that she was noticing on social media. This is what she wrote. She said, everyone on social media, maybe you've seen this too, everyone on social media is asserting their boundaries. Everyone is cutting toxicity out of their life. Everyone is prioritizing their own healing journey and giving up on one-sided relationships. Everyone is disarming the narcissist, protecting their space, deleting that number, going no contact, or at least it feels that way. She says there is a mode of self-help, overwhelmingly generated and reinforced online, that I call the dump them school of thought. It solves every problem with an elegant, unified simplicity. Just dump them. Whether it's your mother failing to respect your child-rearing rules, your boyfriend who said something hurtful, or your friend who flaked on you twice in a row, you know what you need to do. Dump them. Cut them off. Other critics have called this throwaway culture, where everything, including friendships, are disposable. You disagree. Now, let me say very, very clearly, as I hope you've heard me say other times, there are definitely circumstances in which we need boundaries. There are definitely places where relationships cannot be safely or healthily continued. That's not what Claire Coffey is writing about. She's saying there are lots of other places where, even though it is very difficult to stay in relationship, Christian people should demonstrate chesed. It should show up in our lives as we work through things that are hard. It should show up in the church. The friends that Jonathan Sharks was talking about as he died, they were friends, he also said in the paper, in the article, that he made in church. He talked about going to church and going to a small group Bible study, and he talked about how weird it was to him when he was first invited. He would go in, and he's like, I didn't know what to do, so I went right over to where everyone else was at the snacks, he said. And he said they sang a few songs. He called them life groups in their church. They were like small group Bible studies. And he stayed. It wasn't that weird. They sang a couple of songs. They read some scriptures. They broke off and prayed for each other. And at the end, as he was going to leave, his pastor said, hey, would you come back next week? And he said, okay. And he kept going for 7 years. And at the end of the story, he said, I began realizing after 7 years, right up until he died, until he could no longer go. He said, I realized, he wrote, I was seeing the same people every week, and I was telling them about my problems, and they were telling them about me about theirs. And you do that for long enough, he said, and you become friends. Making the commitment to come every week is hard. Maybe you identify this. He said, not all people are easy to deal with. You don't have to say amen, but this. You may not have a lot in common. You have to search for things to talk about. You can be vulnerable with people, and they don't always respond how you would expect. And you certainly don't always agree with them on how they see the world. And yet, he says, I can't imagine not being a part of this community now. Human beings aren't supposed to go through life as faces in a crowd. It's like the song from Cheers. Sometimes you want to go where everyone knows your name. And then he says, church is a different kind of insurance. People talk a lot about medical insurance and life insurance when you get sick, but relational insurance is far more important. You know what he's saying? Church is supposed to be relational insurance. That's hesed. That's a commitment to give yourself to and for another person. There's one last piece, and it's not that long, but just for a moment. Who is God calling you to show hesed to? Is there a relationship you need to reaffirm your commitment to? Are you building relationships now where you can show hesed? Are you committed to that? This is what Hesed is. So where does it come from? And that's an important question. Ruth, where does Ruth get this idea? I mean, I've already mentioned it, but where does she come up with it? She's just this incredible, heroic, remarkable woman. Where does she come up with this? Where does this speech come from? Out of the blue on this dusty road? And where does she get the courage to do this? It's not a mystery. I've already mentioned it. For 10 years, she's been living with Naomi, who clearly, as we hear Naomi pray for her daughters-in-law, clearly, and we're going to hear it, Naomi has her own struggles with faith, but Naomi clearly, in some way, still loves God, is still committed to God, and for 10 years, no doubt, has been praying some kind of prayer like that in her home. If she prays it in crisis on the road, my guess is she prayed it the 10 years before. Ruth has been watching. Ruth has been listening. She's been learning not just about Hesed, but about the God of Hesed, the God of covenant commitment. And so at this moment on the road, it is not just that Ruth gives herself to Naomi, she does, but she gives herself, far more importantly, to someone greater. Did you hear it? Look back down at verse 15. This is what Naomi says to her. It's kind of surprising words. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Do you hear that? Your people, your native people, your native gods. She's going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. And Ruth says, don't urge me to go back. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. This is conversion. Do you see this? What Ruth is doing in this moment is saying, enough with the gods of my own people. I am today not just committing to you, I'm committing to the God of Hesed. Your God is my God. And in fact, there's even more proof of that, because you see what she does at the end is one of the most stunning parts of this whole thing. She says in verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And then she says, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. This is a striking thing. Several commentators point out that the word where she says, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, may indicate a kind of hand gesture. Like taking your finger and pulling it across your throat. Or one commentator says like putting your finger to your temple like you're holding a gun to your head. The word is a graphic word. So it may be that Ruth says, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely. And she pulls her finger. I mean, can you see this woman? That's a covenant oath. But it's not just that she makes this incredible, incredible commitment, invoking God. It's that she invokes the God of Israel by name. Lord, we're talking about this in the men's study on Wednesday night. When you see Lord, L-O-R-D, in all caps, she says, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely. When you see that, in our English translations, that is the translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh. That is the name of Israel's God. That's like going from talking generically about God to, I believe in God, I have a higher power, to saying, Jesus is my Lord. Do you know the difference between those two? There's a guy at the gym, I was saying this, at the YMCA, and when I've been working out, Stephen sees him too, is this guy, and you see people, maybe somebody says, I thank God for whatever, but this guy has a hat that he wears every time he's in there that says, Jesus saved my life. Now that's a different kind of statement when your hat says, Jesus saved my life. And we both talked to him. I said, yeah, he saved mine too. He's like, I can't believe it, can you? Now what Ruth is saying is not just, I'll trust your God, whoever it is. She's saying, I commit myself to Yahweh, to this Lord. I'm calling him by name, and I'm calling him to witness this covenant because I know he is a God of covenant. And so I'm calling him right here by name, saying I'm committing before him, and to you with this Lord, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as my witness. In other words, where does this come from? Where does Hesed come from? It's kind of a miracle, isn't it? Yes, if you have Hesed, it is not. Hesed in the Bible is not a cold calculation of someday I'm going to need people, so I better be there for them. Hesed is, there is a God of glorious Hesed who has loved me with an unfailing love, so that, trusting in his love that will never fail, I can love others in a way that won't fail, so help me God. Where does Hesed come from? It comes from heaven. It comes from God, first to us and then through us. And you need that if you're going to live this out. Whenever I have a couple that I'm marrying, that I'm performing the marriage for, it gets a little awkward talking about that. I will talk with them about, we'll read through the vows at one point because I want them to hear them before they're standing in front of everybody and saying, yes to what? Excuse me? Right? You've heard those traditional wedding vows? In sickness and in health, for better or for worse, till death do us part. And I'll make them read it, and we kind of sit there, and then I'll say something like, who makes vows like that? I mean, just sweeping vows, standing on the brink of literally God only knows what. Who does that? I think increasingly, people who do that are people who believe that there is a God who not only tells us that that kind of commitment is good and beautiful and heroic, but a God who also says, you do that because I am the kind of God who commits to you like that. And wherever this commitment takes you, I will be there ahead of you with a love that never fails. Who lives out Hesed? People who believe that wherever our commitments and our self-sacrifice takes us, we'll find God is already there ahead of us with His unfailing love, ready to catch us and support us and walk us forward. Where does Hesed come from? It comes from God. And we can't end without thinking of this. Ruth somehow caught a glimpse of that just from watching Naomi, I think. But from where we stand today in the great story of redemption history, can't we see even more clearly the covenant faithfulness of God? Can't we? On the other side of Jesus Christ. Ruth says to Naomi, I'll die with you. Jesus says to you, I have died for you. Ruth says, if I break the covenant, if I am unfaithful, let me be cursed. Jesus says, you broke the covenant, you were unfaithful, but I am so faithful to you, I will take your curse on me on the cross so that you can be blessed. Ruth runs a finger across her throat and says, let my blood be shed if I fail you. Jesus said, my blood was shed and poured out for you every last bit till I died, so that you could know that my love will never fail. There is no length to which I will not go to save those who are my own. What more can be done? What more can be demonstrated of God's faithfulness than what Christ has done in His death and resurrection? Amen? So look at Jesus. Trust in Jesus. And live with Hesed. Would you just take a moment of quiet? Just ask the Holy Spirit to apply His word to our heart. And I'll close us in prayer and we'll sing.